Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today we are going to be talking about the Detroit Lions, specifically what I want to see in week 2 of the preseason, who's on the bubble, and a 53-man roster projection along with a 12-man practice squad projection. And it's at this point that I would like to say, if you are an enjoyer of Detroit Lions football, the University of Michigan football, or just a fan of intelligent and well thought out commentary that stays away from hot takes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because that's what I do on this channel. Currently, I post 2 videos a week, one on Tuesday and one on Friday. To start things out, I'm going to address the 2 wide receiver injuries that we've had in this past week, that being Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams. Now, they're both minor injuries. The hamstring injury for Jameson Williams is likely going to keep him sidelined for the rest of the preseason. St. Brown had an ankle injury, I believe, but he should be ready for the first game of the season, which is really all that matters. Now, Jameson Williams also hurt his hamstring earlier on in the offseason. However, this was not the same hamstring. I am now going to use the rest of this segment to talk about Jameson Williams in what I believe to be an honest and fair manner. And I'm going to do that by putting my complaints in 2 different categories. Or at least they're not all my complaints, just complaints and criticisms that I've heard of Jameson Williams, and I'm going to put them into 2 different categories. What I call real legitimate criticism and fake or not legitimate criticism. The real complaints surrounding Jameson Williams are as follows. He does appear to be somebody who might, in the NFL, have a bit of an injury problem. He's had multiple soft issue injuries since he's come back from the ACL, and they haven't even been in games. They've been during practice where you're not hitting as hard as you would during a game, or at least you're not getting hit as often as you would be in a game. The drops are another area of concern that I would consider a legitimate criticism. Now, we have seen multiple wide receivers who are now very, very good in the NFL to begin their careers struggle catching the ball. The most notable of which would be Jamar Chase, who couldn't catch anything the first month and a half of his NFL career. Christian Watson, I believe, also had a similar transitionary struggle when it came to catching the football, but towards the end of this past year, he did kind of figure it out, and he stopped dropping as many passes as he caught, essentially. But on the flip side, to use another Packers wide receiver as an example, Marquez Valdes-Scantling always struggled with drops and continues to do so to this day. So when I hear someone talk about those 2 things, the injuries and the drops, I generally take what they have to say more seriously than if they were to talk about some of the other quote-unquote concerns with Jameson Williams. The chief concern that a lot of people have about Jameson Williams, even though I believe it to be unwarranted, is a quote-unquote off the field or quote-unquote character concerns surrounding him. There have also been rumblings about his work ethic, and I do not believe any of those to be legitimate. In order for something off the field to warrant genuine concern for me, it would have to be illegal, or there would have to be genuine evidence that his play on the field is worse because of it. So illegal stuff, there's a million of examples. You can use whichever one you want to. But when it comes to stuff that isn't illegal being concerning, Kyler Murray with the Call of Duty, where people on Twitter found out that during double XP weekends, he was dramatically worse on the field. That's concerning. That's like a legitimate thing that they have to put into his contract, that he doesn't play Call of Duty during the season. Like, I don't know if it's at all or if it's like less than 2 hours a week or something like that. I don't know what the exact conditions of that are. And nothing that Jameson Williams has done off the field has warranted that kind of criticism. In fact, I saw somebody on Twitter today compare him to Charles Rogers, a man who got injured and then got addicted to opioids, which then led to heroin, which became so bad that he was out of the NFL by like year 3. those people who say stuff like that, you don't listen to them again. If somebody says something like that, don't take them seriously. As far as work ethic goes, again, I don't think that's a legitimate concern. The fact of the matter is that Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes have been fairly open when they don't like the effort of one of their players. A recent example would be earlier on in the offseason when they came out and said pretty bluntly and matter-of-factly that Ifeatu Melifonwu had not been putting in the kind of effort that they wanted to see from him. And at times they have shown frustration with Jameson Williams, but that's likely due to the injuries and the fact that he couldn't play for 75% of his rookie year, and then now he gets suspended for a very easily avoidable thing. So they do appear to be at least somewhat frustrated with Jameson Williams, but I don't think that has anything to do with work ethic or character concerns. In fact, like every single Lions fan ever has been talking about how they only draft Dan Campbell guys. They only draft guys who work hard. They traded up to draft Jameson Williams. They traded up 20 spots. You don't do that if you think the person has character concerns. And this past draft, they passed on the best player in the draft at a position of need, being Jalen Carter, because he had off-the-field concerns. So people who are talking about Jameson Williams having character concerns are being openly contradictory, and you should not take them or their commentary seriously. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what I want to see out of the offense in this upcoming game against the Jags. To start off with, I want to see the offensive rookies, specifically Laporta and Gibbs, get more reps than they did in this previous game. I'd like to see a relatively extended look at them, as they're going to be major contributors for this upcoming season. Like maybe the whole first half. Back when we had 4 preseason games, what the typical thing used to be no starters week 1 and week 4. Week 2, the starters would get a series or two, and week 3, they'd usually play the whole first half, and it would be like a warm-up game. Now we don't really see that anymore because there are only 3 preseason games. But I would still really like to see those high-drafted rookies that we know are going to be contributors on this football team get an extended amount of play before the final preseason game, where I doubt any of them are going to play. I put Jared Goff and David Montgomery on the screen as well, because those are 2 players that I would like to see. Now, it would not surprise me if Jared Goff got like 1 or 2 series and then Teddy Bridgewater came in to work with a lot of the ones for like the remainder of the first quarter or something. But I do want to see David Montgomery get a carry or 2. I want to see David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs on the field at the same time. I'd also like to see potentially what that rotation would look like. I do fully expect David Montgomery to be on the field far more than Jahmyr Gibbs. I think Montgomery is also probably going to end the year with almost twice as many carries, not touches, but carries, than Jahmyr Gibbs, barring injury, of course. Then in the second half, I do want to see the battle for the last running back spot. We know 3 of the 4 running backs that are going to make this roster, or running backs. I do lump Kabinda into that group as opposed to like tight ends or something like that. So I think they're going to carry 4, but Kabinda is one of them. It's going to be Montgomery and Gibbs making the other 3. I think they only carry 1 more on top of that, and currently I believe the leader of that group of running backs being Snell, Ozigba, Reynolds, and Jefferson. I think the leader right now, because of his value on special teams, is Craig Reynolds, who we also didn't see last week, so that's another good sign for him. Another thing that I want to see is how the wide receiver battle plays out. I think there is pretty clearly a leader to make the team as that 5th wide receiver, with Jameson Williams starting off on the suspended list. I think Coda is currently the leader, with Dylan Drummond and Antoine Green likely being practice squad candidates, potentially even protected practice squad candidates. Defensively, the 2 most interesting battles throughout this entire offseason for me have been who's going to be the depth in the cornerback room and who's going to start at linebacker. Right now, if I had to guess, the starters are likely Anzalone and Jack Campbell, with Malcolm Rodriguez probably replacing either Anzalone or Jack Campbell in passing down situations, with Derek Barnes probably actually being the guy who's going to come in if one of those two guys gets hurt. And Jalen Reeves-Maybin is going to be a core special teams player. He is one of the best special teams players in the NFL, and I also could see him having a role in the linebacker room during actual defensive play, whether that be as a matchup guy against a running back or a tight end, or as a potential blitzer. Now, Derek Barnes and Malcolm Rodriguez both had an excellent game the first week of preseason. I put Tracy Walker on the screen as well, but that's really just a representation of the DB group as a whole. I'm really interested to see who the starters are going to be, and specifically when it comes to Tracy Walker, what is his role going to be? Is he going to be the defensive back that comes in and takes a linebacker out during obvious passing situations? Is he going to be in a straight rotation with Kirby Joseph and CJ Gardner-Johnson? Or is he just going to kind of be a situational player? Because I think Tracy Walker is one of the best safeties in the NFL. I think he's above quality starter, but below Pro Bowl caliber. He's in that sort of weird gray area between those two standards, in my opinion. I think Kirby Joseph has Pro Bowl upside. I think Gardner-Johnson proved last year that he's one of the best safeties in the NFL and a legitimate all-pro candidate. Along with Brian Branch, I think the Lions might have the best safety room in the entire NFL. And we already know what Brian Branch's role is going to be on this team. He's going to be the nickel. He's going to start there, and he's going to play between 70 and 85% of the snaps. But getting away from the safeties, the cornerback room is also very interesting to me, because we know that Jacobs and Sutton are likely going to be the two starters, with Mosley being hurt and probably starting the year on either the IR or the PUP list. But who's going to be behind that? Who's going to be the depth? I want to see somebody step up and make this roster. That's what I'm looking for the most, probably defensively. So, for Bubble Watch on offense, I'm going to give you two guys. One that improved their stock, or at least their stock was actually higher than I thought it was, like this week, and one who had their stock decrease. And the person whose stock I actually might have misjudged was Craig Reynolds. I think he's probably on the bubble still, but closer to the safe side of the bubble than the getting cut side of the bubble. And I think it's the exact opposite for Matt Nelson. He had a bad game this past week. I think Connor Galvin outplayed him. I think Eze, as just a potential practice squad player, is also likely ahead of Matt Nelson. We kind of know who Matt Nelson is at this point, and I don't even think he's really like quality depth. I think he's below average depth for the NFL. The Bubble Watch for the defense, the player who improved his stock in this past week, in my opinion, is Julian Okwara, and the player whose stock decreased was James Houston. James Houston didn't have a bad game, but he had the kind of game where you realize pressures don't actually mean anything, because he had 3 or 4 pressures and none of them affected the football play. In fact, one of his pressures was when he slipped down and fell at the quarterback's feet, when it should have very clearly been an easy sack for him, but he slipped and fell. Julian Okwara, on the other hand, made his plays very effectively. He dominated the third string offensive line, and I think dramatically improved his stock for making the team. Typically, NFL teams will keep 10 or 11 defensive linemen / edge players, and Julian Okwara would currently be the 11th guy in that rotation, so he's right on the edge. I count James Houston as a linebacker because they have been trying to play him as a Sam more often, but they're also essentially the same player. Julian Okwara did play quite a bit of Sam last year, and as well as a sort of traditional 3-4 outside linebacker role, along with being a starter on several special teams. Breaking down the battle between Julian Okwara and James Houston, even though he's only in his second year and Julian Okwara is in his 4th, I believe, James Houston has more proven NFL production than Julian Okwara. That being said, Julian Okwara was always going to be a project when he came out, and potentially a guy that needed a few years to figure it out. And going off of the one preseason game, he might have, again, it's one preseason game, and you can't really take anything away from preseason. But he might be putting it all together, and he might become a potential legitimate rotational caliber player who can actually get to the quarterback at times. James Houston, on the other hand, does not have 3-down player in his ceiling. I don't think he does. I think his ceiling is an extraordinarily effective pass rusher who's only on the field for probably 15 to 20 snaps a game and can maybe get you 4 or 5 pressures. That's what I think James Houston's potential ceiling is, but he's not someone who's going to be in the game if it's 50-50 run or pass, because at times last year and in the one preseason game, he was straight up a liability in the run game. Julian Okwara is not good against the run, so to say, but he isn't a liability. And when it comes to special teams, Julian Okwara is effective, and he also is probably not someone who you're going to want to put on certain special teams like kickoff, but he's on kick return and punt return, I believe. James Houston can play all 4 special teams if you want him to. So when it comes down to who's going to make the roster, there are 3 things that you need to consider for the positions that Julian Okwara and James Houston play. That is pass rush ability, run stopping ability, and special teams value. When it comes to pass rush upside, it's James Houston, and that's pretty clear. When it comes to run stopping upside, that's Julian Okwara, and it's pretty clear. When it comes to special teams value and upside, I think they're pretty comparable, but I would give James Houston a slight edge, which is why if it comes down to Julian Okwara versus James Houston for who's going to be that 11th defensive lineman, I do think James Houston does slightly have the edge. But we still have 2 more preseason games and 3 weeks of practice before cuts are due, so that could change. So what's on screen right now, is how I would see the roster breaking down right now. I could be wrong. In fact, chances are I'm very wrong. But I am making what I would say is an educated guess, but it is still a guess. So at the quarterback position, they're likely to keep 2 on the 53-man roster and then 1 on the practice squad. So that's what that 2 + 1 means. Running backs, I think we're going to keep 4. I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but those 4 are going to be Montgomery, Gibbs, Kabinda, and Reynolds is my official prediction to be RB3, and then 1 likely practice squad candidate in my mind. At tight end, I think we're only keeping 3. Last year we kept 4 on the initial 53-man roster, but that was because one of those tight ends was meant to replace Kabinda's role, and that's not how it ended up working out. So the 3 tight ends that I think are going to make the roster are Laporta, obviously, Wright, obviously, and Mitchell, I think, is going to be the last one. Wide receivers, I think right now it's also pretty clear, and that's going to be St. Brown, Marvin Jones, Khalif Raymond, Josh Reynolds, and Chase Cota. Cota, to me, is leading that wide receiver 5 battle by a bit of a margin. Like, I do think there's some space there between Antoine Green and Dylan Drummond. It's not something that can't be overcome, but I do think Cota has a chance to make the initial 53-man roster. However, he would likely be the cut for when Jameson Williams comes back week 7. Offensive line, specifically the tackle, I think there's a good chance we keep 4, and that's going to be Taylor Decker, Penei Sewell, Jermaine Ifedi, and Sorsdal. Sorsdal, probably a guard, but he can play right tackle in a pinch. And then they're also likely to keep 1 more tackle on the practice squad. Interior offensive line is going to be Jonah Jackson, Frank Ragnow, Halapaludi Vaitai, and Graham Glasgow, along with Coyote Aushika. So that's 5, and then likely again another 1 on the practice squad. So that's 23 total 53-man roster spots and 6 practice squad spots. Defensively, this is how I see the initial 53-man roster shaking out. At the edge position, I think they're going to keep 6, which is a little bit unusual, but they're all so good that I think they'll be able to rotate them properly and be protected in case of injuries. The 6 players that I am predicting to make the roster are Aiden Hutchinson, obviously, Charles Harris, who has been starting across from Hutchinson since day one, John Kaminsky, who's going to be the first player off the bench, Romeo Okwara, Josh Pascal, and Julian Okwara. Along the interior, I think they're going to keep 5 players with a practice squad candidate, and those players are going to be Liam McNeil, Isaiah Buggs, Broderick Martin, Levi Onwuzurike, and Benito Jones. At linebacker, I have them keeping 6 players and a practice squad player, which, again, is not normal. Normally, it's only 5 players, but I think the Lions do have the versatility in the secondary to keep an extra linebacker and 1 less defensive back than typical. The linebackers that are going to make the roster: Jack Campbell, Alex Anzalone, Malcolm Rodriguez, Derek Barnes, Jalen Reeves-Maybin, and James Houston. In the secondary at the cornerback position, the 5 players that I am predicting to make the roster: Cameron Sutton, Jerry Jacobs, Will Harris, Starling Thomas, and Savion Smith. At safety, I have 4 players making the roster, that being CJ Gardner-Johnson, Kirby Joseph, Tracy Walker, and Brian Branch. Normally you keep 10 defensive backs, but we have so much versatility in this group that I think you can get away with only 9 DBs on the initial roster. And along with 4 practice squad candidates in that DB group, that brings us to 26 players plus 6 practice squad players. Finally, that leaves us with our 3 special teams players only, that being Riley Patterson, Jack Fox, and Scott Daly. That brings us to 53 players total, along with 12 practice squad players, who are Adrian Martinez, Divine Ozigbo, Dylan Drummond, Antoine Green, Connor Galvin, Opena Eze, Corey Duran, Trevor Nowalski, Brady Breeze, Brandon Joseph, Stephen Gilmore, and Chase Lucas. And the last thing that I'm going to say here is that this 53-man roster is fairly unlikely, but it is the one that I kind of want. I want to keep all those defensive linemen. I want to be able to rotate and play 5 or 6 edge rushers and 5 genuine interior guys, while also having a surprising amount of versatility at the linebacker position, while somewhat suffering along the offensive line when it comes to depth and the secondary. Also, these practice squad predictions are fairly unlikely to happen. The fact of the matter is that you don't get to keep all of your players that you might want to put on the practice squad, and you're very likely to sign players that other teams cut or claim them through waivers or do stuff like that. So this 53-man roster does come with that caveat, and this 12-man practice squad also comes with the understanding that it isn't going to be just players that have played for the Lions this offseason. And that is all that I have for you today. Go ahead and like if you liked the video, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagreed with me at any point in the video, or if you just have something to say, go ahead and leave a comment down in the comment section below, but let's keep it civil. After all, what do I know? I'm just some asshole, and I'll see you next time.